Welcome to the last webinar in our series, Producing Robust Livestock Through Nutrition, Genetic, and Soil Health Management. So far, we've heard about beef cattle nutrition from Dr. Brian Vanderlei at the Great Plains Veterinary Education Center, grazing quality forages and practical soil health from Dr. Woody Lane out in Oregon. And then we also learned a little bit about genetics from Dr. Jamie Porter at Neogen. So I see people are starting to file in. We will just go ahead and jump right in. Today, we're going to be here hearing from horse nutrition from Dr. Jenna Moline. But before I introduce her, I have a few housekeeping items. So first of all, this webinar, as are the rest of the webinars in this series, are worth 1 American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists continuing education credit. So if that applies to you, make sure you go and get that credit. Secondly, someone who has attended all 4 of these webinars will be chosen to receive 1 free NIR analysis and some Ward gear. Of course, they had to actually be in attendance for the live webinars. We would appreciate if all of your questions were submitted either by chat or into the Q&A, and Dr. Moline will be answering those questions at the end. And finally, this webinar is being recorded, and you can find this and the rest of the webinars in this series on our Ward Laboratories YouTube page. So I'm going to go ahead and let Dr. Moline to share her screen. Let's see. Oh. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. So Dr. Jenna Moline graduated in 2018 from the Washington State University. Having grown up on a cattle ranch in Wyoming, Dr. Moline became the family horse girl at a young age. She learned to break and train horses, participated in 4-H, FFA, and rodeos, and sought equine opportunities at every turn. She has taken a non-traditional route to becoming a veterinarian. Dr. Jenna Moline has a Bachelor's of Science in Music Theory and Applied Music from the University of Idaho and worked in New York City in the finance industry. She then returned to Wyoming to complete a Bachelor's of Science in Animal and Veterinary Sciences and a Master's in Animal Nutrition prior to attending veterinary school. After completing the 18-month field internship with Hagyard Equine Institute, Dr. Moline is enthusiastic to join the team as an associate veterinarian. Dr. Moline has a special interest in equine dentistry, sports medicine, and Western performance horses. When not working, you can find her outdoors, hiking with her 2 dogs, working with her, what's an OTTV?
Off-track thoroughbred.
Oh, her horse Kit, for those of us not in the know, and learning the finer details of home ownership. So lots of exciting things and a very unique perspective. Me and Jenna spent hours and hours learning nutrition together. So I'm very excited to have her on and learn a bit about horses. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Jenna.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Becca. First of all, I just want to say thanks to Becca and to Ward Laboratories for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you guys today. I get to combine 2 of my favorite things, which is nutrition and horses, and talk about it, and hope to give you some new perspectives on some things that you may or may not have known about nutrition. And so I do have to give a little bit of disclaimer. I titled this talk months ago before I started putting things together, and things have evolved a little bit, and so the title is still Nutritional Habits of Modern Equids, and we'll just kind of see where we go today and hopefully teach you guys some new information. So what are we going to cover today? So first of all, we're going to talk a little bit about the evolution that has brought us to what we consider the modern horse, modern equid. How has their dentistry changed? How have things with the horse changed that have also influenced their diet and what we feed them? we're going to just spend a little bit of time talking also about a survey that was done that goes into some details about what horse owners know about nutrition and maybe what they don't know about nutrition as well. Then the purpose of this talk today is not really to cover the fundamentals of nutrition. So we're going to spend like 30 seconds talking about what are the fundamentals of nutrition. If you have questions about any of those parts, I'm happy to get you guys some resources and give you guys some more information there. And it's probably stuff that you've also heard in some of the lectures with the other rest of the series. The last thing we're going to touch on today is endocrine horse nutrition. And so endocrine horses are things like our Cushing's horses, metabolic horses. These are horses that from a dietary nutritional perspective, there are a lot of things that we can do to help manage these horses and correct some of the problems that they have. So I forgot that Becca had an intro on me, so I threw on some pictures up here. This is that horse that is to blame for getting me started into the horse world. This was Melody. She was a Missouri Foxtrotter and just one of my favorite horses that I've ever gotten to know. And like that Becca said, I ended up taking a non-traditional route, lived in New York for a while, ended up coming back to Wyoming. And like Becca said, we spent many, many hours studying biochemistry, nutrition, and statistics, and all sorts of really fun topics. And getting to do different masters, but both of us were with the same advisor and both doing nutrition. So it was fun getting to go through that together. Those are my two sidekicks. They are my constant companions, and sometimes they get to go in the truck with me, but most of the time they just stay home occupied. Probably about 90% of the time, this is how you would find me. This is I'm an ambulatory field veterinarian, and so I spend a lot of time in my vehicle traveling around, generally with a cup of coffee in front of me, and I'm a little bit of a caffeine addict, so I actually already had some coffee this afternoon to back up. So. All right, so let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about the evolution of the horse and the prehistoric horses that got us there. So dentistry is a passion of mine. I really enjoy learning about dentistry. I love the effect that you can have just making small changes to the horse's mouth and seeing how much better they do with that. And so we've gotten to what we consider the current horse, and that started about 55 million years ago. And this was the Hyracotherium, which is this skull that's on the very top over here. And you can just see how different that skull looks compared to the modern horse skull that we think of. The jawline itself is very short. Those prehistoric horses were considered brachiodonts in their teeth structure. And what that refers to, and there's a really good slide on the next page, but what that refers to is their tooth, it didn't have much crown to it. So it would be very similar in structure to our teeth as far as a very short crown. They didn't have a cementum covering, so the teeth weren't particularly good for chewing. So they've done some studies where they've gone back, and it's called the mesowear, and they've looked at those teeth, and they can determine based on some of the abrasion patterns what those horses used to. And so what they found was the Hyracotherium was actually a frugivore, which is just a fancy way for saying that it ate fruit. And as we went from 55 million years ago to about 20 million years ago, we started to evolve from frugivores to more of a browser eating. So 20 million years ago is when we see the Mesohippus, and that takes us up to about 5 million years ago when we saw the Meryhippus. And these are kind of these two middle schools, that the jawline is starting to deepen. We're starting to get more of a cheek teeth grow, which the cheek teeth are really those teeth that sit in the cheek. We're also starting to see the skull itself deepen. So what they have found with that mesowear is that these animals, they actually ate a lot coarser materials than what we see horses eating today. So they ate a lot of woody stemmed plants, a lot of just really abrasive. So their teeth had a lot more wear to it than what we see with our grazers today. And then what we know and love as the horse today, the Equids species, they came in about 4.5 million years ago. What's interesting is when the Equids species finally evolved, they thought for a while that maybe they became grazers because they had evolved into it. But the grazing lands were there long before the Equids developed. And so we don't see until we started to grassland grazers. But about 4.5 million years ago, we do see based on that mesosphere that they were starting to eat more grasses. They were starting to become more grazers. They would go out into the plains. What's also interesting is that over these 55 million years, the prehistoric and horse dentition really hasn't changed. So this Hyracotherium, it still had on each upper and lower section of its mouth, it still had 3 incisors up above. It had 3 incisors, a canine, 4 premolars, and 3 molars. And the only changes we've seen with that is that as we've evolved, the horse has lost its premolar 1, which is it can still show up in animals, but we don't worry if it's not there. I'm sure if you have horses, you've seen what that wolf tooth looks like. It's very small. A lot of times we just pop them out while we're in there. And so we've seen that as the horse's skull has evolved, their teeth has changed very little in the actual number of teeth. And so again, being a little bit of a nerd with some of this stuff, I had way too much fun this weekend researching different pictures, different things. And so I just like the way, again, that this shows you on here. On the bottom, these are our brachiodonts, and you can see how short of a crown there is on that tooth. Again, they weren't cementing covered. They had to eat very soft fruit vegetation. And then over the years, that crown lengthens and lengthens, and we get this really nice hypsodont tooth, which is what the horse is now. And we can see how long the crown of that tooth is as well. And minus all of the education and knowledge that I took with vet school, this was probably one of my favorite things that I got to physically take with me from vet school. This is an equine school that I made in between my first and second years. And what I love on this is it shows you how deep and how long the crowns of those teeth are. And so we just made little pockets here so you can see that tooth sits in the skull. One of the things that is a little bit of a misnomer, you'll hear a lot of people say that horses' teeth grow. Well, they don't continually grow. I mean, just like any species, they have their baby teeth. Those, as their permanent teeth come in, they do grow for a few years. But then this is a fairly young horse, and you can see how deep that root structure is in that horse. Well, what happens is horses have continuously erupting. And so as time goes on, these teeth will slowly erupt a couple millimeters, which is why things like floating your horse's teeth are so important, is that over time, they'll just keep pushing up and up and up until we're now seeing, yeah.
I hate to interrupt you, but you're cutting out in and out. It's really hard to understand what's going on. So I don't know if it's because you're in that large room or if you need to move the laptop closer to you, but it's like, we'll hear you and then we won't hear you.
Is that any better?
Yeah, that sounds a lot better.
Okay. It's probably, I will try to be a little bit closer to it then.
Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Sorry. Do I need to go back or are we okay just to keep going from here?
Start when you were talking about the roots and the teeth again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So the horse as we know it today, so you'll hear a lot of people say that horse teeth are continuously growing. And that's not true. So the horse tooth, just like every species, their tooth only grows for a few years. And then this is an adult horse. It's a fairly young horse. And you can see how deep that tooth root goes into the mandible and into the maxilla. And so what happens is that over time, those teeth continuously erupt. And so they erupt a couple millimeters each year. And as that tooth erupts, eventually when they're 30, we don't have much tooth left. But so that's just a small point that I just wanted to make, was that the equine tooth is a continuously erupting tooth. So we've kind of covered some of the dentistry evolution. Let's talk about the horse and how what we've done with the horse has changed the way that we feed them as well. And so the domestication of the horse happened about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. So about the time that we had the Equids species is when we started to domesticate them. And this picture here is a picture of a Przewalski horse. They are still alive today. They're considered the closest thing to the first Equids that we have. And I'm like, they were domesticated initially for war and kind of more as beasts of burden. But with that being said, they were supplementing their horses. They were getting grass, but there's a lot of research and study to show that they were getting supplemented a lot of corn and barley and things like that. The other important distinguish to make is that our knowledge about nutrition itself has really only evolved over the last 150, 200 years. And so there was an article in The Horse and Hound, which is a UK online subscription. And one of the things I liked is it pointed out some of the advances that have happened in nutrition. And you can just see, how much we've learned over the last 150 years, but how quickly, once we start to learn things, how quickly things change. And so in 1834 was the first equine supplement. It was just titled Black Drink. I couldn't find anything that talked about what it was for, what it was made of, what its intended purpose was. And then in 1906, in human literature and animals is when we first started to be introduced to vitamins. And this was by the Nobel Peace winner, Frederick Hopkins, who in 1912 actually started to formulate what vitamins were, but the thought of vitamins really happened in 1906. 1907, we saw the first introduction of probiotics into the human nutrition field. And by 1929, we had seen our first equine vitamin and mineral supplement. As you can imagine, with all things, what we learn in one species is quickly transferred to the rest. And so in the 1970s, we had gone through all these advances in ruminant nutrition and human nutrition. In the 1970s, we saw a huge boom in equine feed sources. And so this is what I kind of think of as our bagged feed. And so we had our first extruded product, the Triple Crown Extra Form, and the first micronized feeds were seen in the 70s. That's really not that long ago. 50 years, but not that long ago in the grand scheme of the horse. And then in 1989, we had the first equine balancer, and this was by Bailey's Horse Feed. And then we saw another big boom in equine nutrition in the 90s. And just like you can go into your tack store right now and see the walls of all the different nutrition supplements, in the 90s, we saw this big boom of nutritional supplements for specific diseases. And so some of the big ones are for hoof supplements, for joint supplements, skin supplements. We've seen a lot of specific disease and disorder supplements come out since then. So again, the purpose of the talk today is just to give a little bit of a background, but we can't talk about some of these things without understanding some of the gastrointestinal physiology behind it. And so there's a little bit of information on here. Most of this isn't really, it's interesting facts, but the big thing that I wanted you to get out of this slide was talking about hindgut fermentation. So in this picture here, on the left, we have a cow, in the middle we have the horse, and on the right we have the dog. And the dog is a simple stomach. They're monogastrics, just like we are as humans. And so it's probably the simplest stomach and the simplest gastrointestinal physiology that you can think of. On the left, with the different lectures and the seminars, I'm sure you've gotten a lot more information about the rumen physiology and why that rumen is so important as a foregut fermenter. The horse, they rely on their cecum and their hindgut so their large colon, for hindgut fermentation. And the big difference here is that if a horse is eating a high fiber product, which hays and straws are definitely high fiber, it's not until the hindgut that those products start to get degraded and absorbed. But what is great about the horse is that they can absorb quite a bit of that volatile fatty acid from that fiber degradation in their hindgut. So 95% of VFA absorption in the horse happens in their hindgut. Starches are absorbed in their stomach and their small intestine, but then any that are left over get a second chance of absorption in their hindgut. So horses get two really good chances to digest and absorb any starches. Lipid degradation does happen in the hindgut of horses, although this is an area where there's still a lot of research going on because we just don't know the extent. We don't know the percentage that happens and how well it's absorbed in the hindgut. We do know it happens, but we're not able to quantify it at this point. And the other important thing to note is that protein utilization, 40 to 70% of our nitrogen, the digestion occurs in the hindgut. So overall, the horse does a phenomenal job with that hindgut fermentation. All right, so that's going to kind of take us through all of our information about kind of the evolution of the horse's system and the way we feed them. I want to focus in a little bit right now about this survey. And this survey has a really long title, Equine Nutrition, a survey of perceptions and practices of horse owners undertaking a massive open online course in equine nutrition. And that is quite a mouthful for a title. This was a study it's published in 2015. They sent out basically globally, they sent out 19,000 surveys. And when we get to the end, I'd be really interested if any of you watching today have heard of this study or if any of you were asked to participate in it. One of the things I didn't like is reading through, they didn't talk about how they sent out the survey or how they let people know about this survey. It was the largest survey done on equine nutrition to date, including the highest number of respondents. However, they only had a 34% respondent rate, but that's still just over 6,000 people. So they got quite a bit of information from this and were able to see some pretty good comparisons and make some pretty good conclusions from it. Interesting enough, out of this 6,000 people that did respond, the majority of them were female. And that really is reflective of the horse owning population. There are a lot of women that own horses. Another interesting piece was that over 50% of the respondents had graduate degrees or higher. And so a very highly educated group of respondents with quite a variable amount of horse experience from 1 to 25 years. The 75% of respondents had at least 6 years of experience with horses, and over 30% of the respondents had 23 years or more. So a very educated and a lot of experience in the people that took this survey. Well, what I found interesting with it though, is that 87% of these people said that they fed concentrates or grains, supplements. However, only 29% of them actually weighed their concentrates. And so when we talk about some of the nutritional habits of modern equids and modern horse owners, this is one of the things we need to change. Is when we are measuring things, it's really important that we measure them properly. And so we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about what that means. A really good point about this though, 70% of these respondents, their horses had some sort of access to pasture. Amazingly, all of these horse owners were feeding the appropriate amount of fiber. So it's important for horses to have at least 80% fiber in their diet, which is coming from hays and pastures, grazing that way. So it's really awesome that without even knowing what they were doing, for the people that don't have any experience, for the people that had 25 years plus of experience, horses across the board are getting what they need as far as fiber. 80% do supplement their horses. The biggest thing was salts, and then fats and oils, nutraceuticals, with the most common being food supplements. 24% looked to their veterinarian for advice. The rest was on the recommendation of their trainer, on someone else that had used the product. What was interesting is that they said that 50% of them said that they trusted their veterinarians for advice, but only 24% was actually going to their veterinarian. And I'll be the first to admit, as a veterinarian, we definitely don't know everything. Just the same way that, you know, the farriers, they don't know everything, the dentists don't know everything. And so I think it's a good thing to remember with any of these is that you should be asking your veterinarian, you should be asking your friends, you should be doing your own part. The more educated you can be about what you are giving your horse, it's going to help you make a better decision about what you're feeding your horse as well. Another piece that when it comes to habits that I think we can improve on is that these horses were mainly getting weighed if it was a medical necessity. So if that horse needed to be on antibiotics or needed to have a dosage change of its medication, they were getting weighed for that. Not many people were truly weighing. We'll talk about why that's important again, but there's a lot of reason to be weighing your horse before there's problems. And then the other big take home from this survey was that a lot of people have a really great knowledge about the basics of equine nutrition. But when it came to or knowing things about disease processes or how to for different problems, there wasn't much education there. And so hopefully things like this lecture today will help you get a little bit more information or be able to find some resources of where to go to look for more information. So like I said, we should be weighing our horses more often. And ideally, we would all have a scale and we would all put our horses on that scale and get a true pound or kilogram weight. However, the reality is even the traveling feed companies, I'm lucky in Lexington, Kentucky, we have some feed companies that will travel with a scale and they'll come to the farm, they'll weigh all the horses, so you can get that exact weight. Most of us don't have access to that. A lot of clinics don't even have scales for large animals. And so we can do a couple different things to get a fairly decent estimate of what is our horse's body condition score and what is their weight. And I would encourage, if you're using one of these but not the other, I would really encourage you to learn the other technique and to do both of them. And like I said, really we should be doing this every 2 to 4 weeks to monitor our horse's health. If your horse is starting to have any problems, if they're losing weight, or on the other side, if they're gaining weight, if you're checking them once a month, you're going to catch that. Versus if you're only putting your hands on them, once or twice a year to determine their weight status, you might miss some of those early. So on the left here, this is the most accurate way to use a weight tape. And so a lot of us have those weight tapes at home. You put them around the girth and they tell you the pounds. That is extremely inaccurate. And so what I would encourage you to do is look at how you can take their heart girth and their body length, and there are online calculators that you put those measurements into that will tell you what your horse's estimated weight is. That is really the only semi-accurate way to get an estimate of your horse's weight using. Just doing it around the girth and taking that number is really variable. The best thing about that is if you have the same person doing it in the exact same spot, you're at least going to be able to know if that horse is gaining, even if it's not necessarily a true numerical value. On the right-hand side here, this is the Henneke body condition system. This is what, as veterinarians, we look to determine body condition scores of horses. And it goes on a scale of 1 to 9. There are some really great examples out there. And so one of the things I would encourage you to do is look up this Henneke body conditions system. The Habitat for Your Horses website has it, and it goes through and it talks about all the different pieces and parts to put your hands on and to feel and to really determine what your horse's true body condition score is. Interestingly enough, in that survey that they did, they found that horse owners and trainers routinely underestimate weight. So that's just something to know we're a little bit biased to underestimating our horse's weight rather than overestimating it. And also what's interesting, they found that experience did not make someone any more accurate. And so just because somebody might have 20 years of experience on you doesn't necessarily mean that they're better at estimating your horse's weight. Okay, so now let's talk about measuring our feedstuffs. And this is why true measuring of your feedstuffs is so important. So on the left here, those are good examples of what people say when they feed a scoop. And so a scoop can be a 8-ounce coffee can, it can be a 16-ounce coffee can, it can be a scoop that was designed for a specific feed stuff. But however they say it, what they're really measuring is a volume and not a weight. The same goes with hay. You know, we all feed flakes of hay. Well, your flake of hay might look radically different than my flake of hay. You know, I'm sure if we looked at this hay bale here and we all counted the number of flakes we think that hay bale has, we're going to have some variability. And so if you think about, if you're telling your trainer, yeah, feed my horse 2 flakes of hay twice a day, you might think that that flake weighs a couple pounds, but your trainer might be feeding half a pound, they might be feeding 6-pound flakes. So what I would encourage again for everyone is to look at getting some scales so you can actually weigh your feed. This scale in the middle here, I just wanted to show some different options. That scale costs $180. You can see it's really nice. It's got, you know, a spot that you could dump your grain into it, make it really easy to weigh things. However, if you don't want necessarily the fancy stuff, that scale on the right is $17. And it's easy to hang in a bucket and weigh your feedstuffs. And I think all of us can probably manage $17 to weigh out our feedstuffs. Okay, so again, we're really going to spend little to no time talking about some of the fundamentals with nutrition. But just to be complete, I wanted to give you guys a couple resources. These are 2 of the resources that I love for talking about nutrition with horses. This one on the upper right, if you have done much nutrition in your life, you're very familiar with these guys. That's the National Resource Council's nutrition requirements for horses. That book has a lot of information in it. It's got some great overviews of all the different fundamental nutrients, as well as what the horse's requirements are. If you are trying to figure out how much dry matter your horse needs based on the amount of work it's doing, how many calories, if you're worried about the calcium amount, this book is excellent to go to because it's got, especially if you're any sort of like science math nerd, it's got all sorts of charts in there that will talk about whether your horse is 13 versus 20, what do they need? Are they in light work? Are they in heavy work? Are they pregnant mare? Are they a racing mare? What are they doing that changes those needs for them? The one thing I will caution you with this book is while the NRC does give you a lot of tables for knowing the nutritional values of different, one thing we have found is that these are averages, right? And so the average of Bermuda coastal grass in this book might vary very much from what you find if you're feeding Bermuda coastal grass. So it is really important to be getting your own hay analysis done of the hay you are feeding, as well as doing that anytime that you're changing the source or the year, just making sure that you're staying up with knowing what is in what you are feeding. And then on the left-hand side here, if you have questions about some of the physiology or more information about the different nutrients as far as fats versus carbohydrates, this book on the left does a great job of going into all of those details. They talk a lot about how the horse absorbs different things, where they're absorbing it. There's a lot of great information in that book as well. And just so we're all on the same page, when we're talking about the fundamentals of nutrition, we're talking about energy. We're talking about fats and fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, protein, carbohydrates, and water. These are the things that are essential for any animal to live. And they have different requirements for each of them, all of those changing again based on the physiological status of that horse. For today's purpose, I'm going to just give you a couple quick facts on some things, but really the main thing I want you to think about is these fundamentals of carbohydrates and how those are going to change for our metabolic horses. So just one thing that is helpful to know, which isn't always readily available, is what sort of digestible energy does your horse need? And again, you can look to those tables in the NRC and find that information. But if you wanted to do a quick calculation, you take 33.3 for the amount of kcals and times that by your horse's body weight in kilograms. That's going to give you the amount of calories per day that your horse needs. And when we talk about calories, a lot of times those are referred to as kcals. If you are given things in megacalories, just know that that's the equivalent of 1,000 kcals. So 1 megacalorie equals 1,000 kcals. So when we look down here, so I calculated this for a 500 kilogram horse, which is roughly 1,100 pounds. So an 1,100 pounds, not really doing anything, kind of middle-aged adult, hanging out in the pasture, not really doing any work. They need about 16,650 kcals, or 16 megacals per day. Another thing that I just wanted to highlight when we're talking about these different nutrient values is our water. So your water, especially right now this time of year when our weather is changing, we're having cold spells and going in and out of winter. Water is extremely crucial for preventing things like colic. And so you want to make sure your horse always has access to clean, adequate supply of water. If you have any concerns about your water, I did want to show you one of the things I found on the Ward website was that they do test water as well. So they're not just a hay and feed company. They also test water. And so if you are worried about the suitability of the water that you're providing for your horse, if you have questions, if the total solids in the water is appropriate, you can always send in a water sample to them. As well as, interestingly enough, if you wanted to test your household water, you can get that done through them as well. Okay, so now, like I said, we're really gonna mainly just talk about carbohydrates as far as these nutrients. And so I wanted to try to keep this as simple as possible so we can get on to the interesting stuff with the metabolic horses. But in very simplistic terms, the carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, so these are going to be our ethanol soluble carbohydrates, glucose and fructose, the simple carbohydrate forms, as well as starch. These are very easily digested by our stomach and small intestine. And so like we said earlier, the horse actually gets 2 chances to starch. It does an excellent job of digesting it in their small intestine. And then anything that's left over, they get a second chance to digest once it reaches the starch colon. So the horse utilizes starch very, very well. In their hindgut is where they're going to break down the structural carbohydrates. So these are cellulose, hemicellulose, the more rigid parts of the plant. Opposite to a ruminant, where the ruminant breaks it down first and then passes it through the rest of their system. So they get 2 chances to digest the structural carbohydrates. The horse just gets 1. This is why, as great as the horse is at absorbing some of those nutrients in their large colon, they're not quite as good as breaking down cellulose and hemicellulose as cattle are. And so when we're talking about carbohydrates, we're really talking about pasture access, hay access. Those are the main sources of the carbohydrates in the horse's diet. And so it's also interesting to know that cool season grasses have slightly different chemical compositions than warm season grasses. And so when you're looking at some of these nutrient profiles, just know some of your warm season grasses might look slightly different. Talk with your, if you're running a sample through Becca, talk with Becca and see if that's a normal variation or if that's a higher than normal variation if you're talking about a warm season grass. Okay, so let's look at a dietary analysis and pick apart some of the pieces of it here. So this was a crabgrass sample that was submitted for a horse. And the first thing I want to point out is the moisture content. So in hays for horses, we want their moisture content to be less than 15%. And the reason for that is we know that mold occurs at values over than 15%. And this is all going to be on a dry matter basis. So if the moisture is less than 15%, you are good to go. If it's higher than that, you might want to make sure that there's not any mold or any other problems with that hay. Ideally, the crude protein content of our hays, again on a dry matter basis, should be over 12%. The acid detergent fiber, this is a good indication of the nutrient digestibility, and so we'd like it to be less than 45%. And the neutral detergent fiber, this is a good indication of palatability. We would like that to be less than 65%. And for any of you that do happen to feed Bermuda grass or some of those warm season grasses, this is where we do see some common increases. That Bermuda grass a lot of times is over 65%. And we just know that, we know it's still palatable. So again, there are some variations in this, but that 65% is just a good general rule of thumb. The digestible energy, or DE, we know that this is higher for legumes than it is for grasses. And with the grasses, we know that cool season grasses will have more digestible energy than the warm season grasses. The big takeaway for today's discussion is going to be these non-structural carbohydrates. And so when we get into our discussion about these metabolic endocrine horses, we're going to say that the recommendations are that they have less than 10% of an NSC value. What's interesting is we do have recommendations for horses with PSSM or with endocrine disorders, but there's no guidelines for the normal horse. So outside of the metabolic horses, it's something to make a note of, but the NSC value is probably not as crucial. There are a few ways of calculating the non-structural carb value. There used to be a little bit more of a complex way of doing it, and that was to take your total dry matter and subtract your neutral detergent fiber, your protein, your ether extract, and the ash. Now that just seems like a lot of work, and so they've simplified it. And to determine your non-structural carbohydrates, you can actually just take your starch value, which we see here is 3, and add that to your water-soluble carbohydrates, which we see here is 8.1. And so you would have a value of 11.1 for your non-structural carbohydrates. If this was a metabolic horse, that grass hay would be a little bit high in the non-structural carbohydrates. But if we're just talking a regular horse, this is great. Great hay there. Okay, so now to get to kind of the veterinary perspective of the nutrition and to talk about some of these endocrine horses. So endocrine horses, a lot of information has even changed over the last 5 years with endocrine disease in horses. There used to be kind of a broad overview and they were lumped together. We're starting to find that there are some distinct differences in these horses. And so, for instance, Cushingoid horses, or PPID, which stands for pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction, Cushingoid horses are different than metabolic horses, than the ones that are suffering from equine metabolic syndrome. Those horses tend to have, they can have laminitis that's associated with a increased insulin. They can be insulin resistant. They might be insulin dysfunction. And so equine metabolic syndrome itself is still a very complex group of disorders, but we do know that it is different enough than PPID or Cushing's that we can separate those two. And then as we learn more, hopefully we'll be able to separate out some of those diseases out of the equine metabolic syndrome. So the first one we're going to talk about is our Cushing's or our PPID horses. And if any of you have dogs with Cushing's out there, one thing to know is that the horse Cushing's is different than the dog Cushing's. So in the dog, Cushing's is actually a disease of the adrenal glands. In the horse, the reason Cushing's has another name is because it is more of a pituitary, which is up in the brain. It's more of a disorder of that. And so the pituitary dysfunctions, it often grows a benign adenoma, but it just doesn't release the hormones correctly. So the nice thing is for Cushingoid horses, if you ever see a horse with what's called hypertrichosis, which is a very fancy term for just abnormal long hair. So we think of it, if you see a horse that it looks like it has not shed out its winter coat and we're in June, that's usually a fairly pathognomonic sign for a Cushingoid horse. And so if you see that sign, it's a very strong indication that your horse is likely Cushingoid. Some of the other clinical signs for Cushingoid horses, though, can be Cushing's. They can also be a lot of other things. And so this is, like in this second picture, that horse has lost a lot of the muscle in its epaxial region along its back, that can be a sign of Cushing's. Laminitis, that can be a sign of Cushing's. Having a horse with abnormal subcutaneous fat deposition, that can be a sign of Cushing's. Obviously, that can also be a sign of insulin resistance. And so that's where some of these clinical signs are a little bit hard, which is why we have to go to diagnostics. So on the right-hand side of this here, this table is talking about how we go about choosing what test to run for diagnostics. And this is where it's very important to be keeping track of your horse's body condition, of some of these clinical signs, and have the discussion with your veterinarian, because both PPID and the equine metabolic syndrome can be a little bit frustrating to test for. And part of the reason is depending on the time of year, the hormone values can change. And so that's a conversation to have with your vet about which test is going to be the best to run for your horse. So how do we treat these horses? Well, the nice thing for Cushing's is we do have a pharmaceutical that works really well for these guys. It's called Presend, or Pergolide is the drug name. The one thing to know is if you start your horse on Presend, it's really important that you wait 2 months before you decide whether that drug is working or not. It can take quite a bit of time for your horse to gain weight, for your horse to lose weight, for some of those clinical signs to stabilize. You can recheck their blood work within 4 to 8 weeks, but I wouldn't make any decisions about whether to start or stop treatment if it's been less than the 2 months. From the nutritional aspect, it's very important to be monitoring their body condition score and their weight. We also, for these guys, want to closely monitor their dentistry and parasite control. And then how can we manage them as far as what we feed them? Well, these guys, it's a little bit dependent. If they have normal insulin levels, you can feed them senior grains, you can let them graze, there's no problem there. If your horse, though, has Cushing's and has obesity, that's where we want to start them into a diet program. And so for a lot of those guys, we're either going to withhold grains, withhold pasture grazing. We're going to do something to try to get their calorie level down. There also are supplements that you can give your horse. Thyro-L and Insulin-Wise are probably two of the more common supplements. These are things that are meant to help, but can't replace the nutritional aspect of it as well. Okay, so on a very similar side of that, though, is equine metabolic syndrome. And so I put this table on the left, and I put those question marks in for the signs, because one thing to know is that when you are looking at the clinical signs of equine metabolic syndrome, it can present in any way. So it's actually recommended. I thought this was a little interesting when I was looking things up. It is recommended to run blood work to test and rule out equine metabolic syndrome if you're doing a pre-purchase exam, if you are thinking about using steroids, if you have any sort of infertility problems, if you have a fat horse, a chronic lame horse, almost any reason that your horse seems off, you should have equine metabolic syndrome on the list of potentials, just because it can present anyway. The most common ways it presents, though, are obese, chronically laminitic horses. So again, when we're talking about how are we going to diagnose these horses, what are we going to do for that, it's a little bit complicated. And so it's one of those things where, again, have a good conversation with your vet, talk with them about why they are recommending certain tests, what you're hoping to get in and out of that. The big thing for metabolic horses, which the literature says that 30% of horses in their adult lives will be equine metabolic syndrome horses. It sure seems like I see a lot more horses than that, than 30%. But, you know, I mean, it just might be the area where I'm living. When we're talking about nutritional management, there is a lot we can do for metabolic horses. So the way they break it up is your horse metabolic and obese? Is your horse metabolic but not obese? So if you have an obese metabolic horse, these guys are hard because it is almost all management. not let these guys have any grains, no concentrates, no extra feed. Also, they cannot have any grazing. So it's going to be a purely roughage-based diet. This is where that 10% non-structural carbohydrates becomes so important. If you have an obese metabolic horse, you're going to start them on 1.5% of their body weight in dry matter of a grass hay that is less than 10% non-structural carbs. That is really hard to do. As you saw that crabgrass, it was 11.1, not far off, but a lot of people, if you're running Timothy hay, that might be over that 10%. And so not only are we going to say less than 10% of non-structural carbs, but on top of that, we're also going to soak the hay. So they have found that it is important that the water be cold water so that it can soak, and it can basically, when you soak the hay, it's going to make all the starches and sugars leach out, all those simple sugars. If you use too hot of water though, it can degrade your proteins. And so you don't want to lose all the proteins of that hay. You really just want to lose the starches. So it's important it be cold water, and they recommend it be for at least 60 minutes before you feed. And so again, I sympathize. I have a client that she's been doing a fantastic job, and we're getting some really good progress on her metabolic course, but it is time consuming. And so you want to soak that hay for an hour before you feed it in cold water at a 10% non-structural carbohydrate grass hay. One of the other things you can do that seems to be helpful is feed them with a slow feeder. And that's just helping. Again, we've taken away their grazing. And so we know that horses are supposed to eat constantly. So if you can give it to them in a slow feeder or divide it into really small, frequent meals, that's just going to make your horse's digestive system a lot more happy. Because we are leaching out all of those simple sugars, we're also going to lose our vitamins and minerals. So for these horses, it's extremely important that they be on vitamin and mineral supplements, as well as a protein ration balancer. Again, it's hard because these guys are management, and so it's really important that when you're looking at your ration balancing, you're making sure you're picking that one that is a low sugar content, because otherwise you can reverse all of your good work by soaking that hay if you're giving them a high sugar supplement. So we have an obese metabolic horse. We start them on the right type of hay. We're soaking it. We're not allowing any grazing. We're not allowing any feeding of concentrates. We're starting to see weight loss. What do we do at that point? Well, that's what this lower half here for is. That is a horse that you have gotten it from being obese down to a good body condition score. So for these guys, it's still recommended that you restrict their grazing, that you don't let them have any grains. However, the one thing that changes for these guys, if there are no clinical signs, so you're not having any laminitis, you're not having any problems with health otherwise, you can slowly start to allow these guys to graze. Short strip grazing or using a grazing muzzle and getting them outside is the recommendations, not letting them just have free access to grazing. It's important on these obese metabolic horses that you monitor them closely. There are additional things that your veterinarian might recommend that you try as well, some supplements. The Thyro-L works well for these guys. The sodium glucose co-transporters, metformin hydrochloride, thiazolidines, oh my goodness, that's a hard word to say. And then there's a lot of people that, again, it's a little bit anecdotal, but they're using chromium, resveratrol, or magnesium as supplements in these metabolic horses. I don't think that our science has necessarily caught up with some of the things that we make an effect. The science out there does not support these. However, your vet might recommend them, and it might come from good experience using these supplements as well. So that's for our obese metabolic horses. So what are we going to do for our metabolic horses that aren't obese? That can happen as well. So for these ones, it's very similar to the way we manage the obese horses. We want to measure their non-structural carbohydrates. We want them still on that 10% non-structural carbohydrate. We're going to still provide them then a vitamin and mineral protein ration balance. You still don't want to exercise these guys if they're having clinical signs, but if they are not having clinical signs, no laminitis, no other problems, they can be put back into work. The one difference for the non-obese metabolic horses is the thyroid L supplement specifically. You do not want to use that because thyroid L is meant to stimulate the metabolism and help a horse lose weight. Obviously, if you have a lean metabolic horse, you do not want that horse to lose weight. You do not want to use that thyroid L. You also can have metabolic horses that on top of being metabolic are Cushionoid. So they can have both diseases. It's not a one or the other. And in this, you want to use those similar strategies, just adding in the percent for the Cushing aspect as well. So I'm sure some of you are feeling like this right now and going, oh my gosh, that just seems really confusing. I don't ever want to have a metabolic horse. Well, hopefully this next slide will help you feel a little bit more like this and be able to feel a little bit more confident in how to manage these metabolic horses. So this is a really nice simplified version of what we just talked about. It shows up here, is your horse insulin dysfunctional, dysregulating? No, then manage it. Yes, then you want to test for if it is also Cushionoid. Then you follow that scale down and you decide how to manage it based on if it's obese, if it's not obese, if it has Cushing's, if it does not have Cushing's. And I realize I say that this is an easy follow recommendation. I know that's still very complicated. This is what I love about nutrition is that we've learned a lot. We've still got a lot to learn. But hopefully you will be able to feel a little bit more confident now in managing your horse if you do have a horse that has Cushing's or metabolic syndrome as well. And so with that, that was the bulk of the information I wanted to present today. I hope I've left enough time to take your questions and we can see what Becca's got for us there.
Thank you, Jenna. Again, we just want to thank you for taking your time to present. And we've got three questions here. So the first question comes from Chad Muller, and he says, is 48-hour in vitro NDF digestibility the optimal time for hindgut fermenters, or do you prefer a different in vitro fermentation duration? And I would just like to point out that while in vitro is going to give us an idea of the digestibility, that we're talking about in vitro digestion in rumen fluid. So it's maybe not quite applicable, but I'd still like to hear your thoughts on that, Jenna.
Can you read it one more time?
Is 48-hour in vitro NDF digestibility, IVF, NDFD, the optimal time for hindgut fermenters, or do you prefer a different in vitro fermentation duration?
Yeah, and that's I've not come across anything that talks about in vitro fermentation for the hindgut. Chad, if that's my email on there, if you want to know more, shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to look into it because it's not something I'm familiar with.
Okay, so our next one is more of a statement than a question, and I think you kind of went over this, so I'm not sure if maybe your audio was cutting in and out for it, but Sherry Brodsky says, your approximate analysis formula for NSC is actually for NFC, non-fiber carbohydrates, a totally different value and very outdated. And I think you said that's outdated. And do you want to go ahead and tell us what equation you are recommending that we use for non-structural carbohydrates?
Yeah, and she brings up a really good point because that is from the NRC guidelines. And so if I can figure out how to go back to that slide here. So the non-structural carbohydrates, that terminology has changed a lot as well. Non-structural carbohydrates used to refer to the non-fiber carbohydrates. And so it used to be one and the same of a term, which is why she's exactly correct. It used to be that you would use that non-fiber carbohydrate, but that is outdated. And so there's two ways to do the calculations. I don't know how often like ether extract is given on a dietary analysis. So the simple way to do it is to take your starch and your water soluble carbohydrates and add that together. And that is your non-structural carbohydrate value. So for instance, on this crabgrass example, your starch is 3 and your water soluble carbohydrate is 8.1. So you add those together and this would have an 11.1 value for the non-structural carbohydrate.
Okay, so the next question we have, are these diseases more prone in certain ages, breeds, disciplines, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it definitely does have an age correlation. We see metabolic syndrome being more often in horses over 20. Same thing with the Cushing's. However, as far as breed predilection, not really. We see it in all breeds. There is, for the metabolic syndrome, we do know it's associated with obesity. And so any animals that are more prone to obesity are going to be more likely to be metabolic. So our Icelandic ponies, miniature horses, some of the draft breeds are definitely going to have, I think are going to be more common that we're going to see it, but I see plenty of thoroughbreds, plenty of quarter horses. We just don't have many Arabians around here, but I would guess they have plenty of Arabians.
Okay, the next question I've got here is, how in the world does a horse farm given dry hay and clean water every day survive? You understand what he's asking?
No, but I mean, my guess is just the fact that horses, I mean, I think, you know, we joke a lot as vets that horses are completely god-awful designed, that they were designed to fail. And when I was in vet school, the common saying was that horses are either homicidal or suicidal. And so I don't know if that's what he's referring to, is the fact that horses just weren't very well designed, but that's what I would go with.
Okay. So then I've got a couple different people. Would you mind throwing your email back up there?
Yes.
I've got a couple different people asking about the slides, and these are Jenna's slides. So I'm gonna direct you guys asking for the slides to email her. We are gonna send out a link with this video to those who have registered, and it will also be on our YouTube channel. So we've got that. And then I had a question for you. When you were talking about horses requiring 80% fiber in their diet, and that survey said most horse owners are meeting that, are we talking ADF, NDF, or crude fiber?
More just the percentage of their diet as far, and the reason most horses meet that 80% is because a lot of them are out, even if they're on hay, they're out grazing. We just want the bulk of their diet to be fiber.
Not seeing any more questions coming up. I thought I had a couple more, but I'm not recalling them right now. So I suppose with that, we'll just say thank you again, Jenna. We really appreciated having you on, and that concludes our webinar series. So we appreciate it. This is going to be a great resource that we can share with our equine enthusiasts for a long time. So we appreciate it, and thanks again.